Hey guys, so I spent ages on stream doing these calculations. A lot of people have been asking for this, and this video is finally ready to be made. So just like I did a few months ago with Leaflet's rerun, Ayaka is also coming on the Chronicle banner soon, and since she recently gained a ton of popularity this patch because of premium teams like this, Escoffier teams like this, many of you are wondering, how do you invest in this team? When do you get a weapon? When do you get a constellation? Even something like, how good is Shenhe? But before we get started, I do want to cover a few disclaimers. The rankings I give in this video are just general advice, not set in stone, for two main reasons. Number one, which is that you might get upgrades not according to strength, but rather when they actually rerun. So even if I'm saying a character's C1 is really strong, but if that constellation weapon doesn't rerun for another 5 or 6 months, then there's no point in waiting just for that. You might as well get something else that's actually on the banner. So ultimately, we are subject to Genshin's banner schedule. And the second disclaimer is, as you guys know, it's very hard to calculate things like constellations or weapons, because it's not just about the numbers, but some investments can change the way you actually play. So you can't just tweak the numbers and get a mathematical value from it. Rather, it's actually important to calculate what's known as compounding investment. And by that, I mean some investments get stronger after getting another. And a lot of people make this mistake. Best example I could use to explain this is looking at Raiden. Well, as we all know, Raiden's C1 is not one of the best C1s in the game. So if you were to calculate, starting from scratch, what is the best investment? Maybe you could get Escoffier's weapon on Chevreuse being higher. Maybe you could get a 5-star weapon on Bennett. But it's important to think about compounding investments, which is, if you get Raiden C1, then Raiden C2 is massive, her C3 is massive. Whereas if you never get that C1, you would get all these other things and then just waste your investments. How one 5-star investment could affect the second. Lastly, these calcs were done on stream and it was very tedious and tricky to do. So the numbers might not be perfect, some shortcuts were taken. In the future, once Escoffier gets added to the GC Sim database, I'm hoping we can fine-tune some of these results and I'll be able to get a bit more accurate and much faster information. So maybe we can update these numbers in the future. So with that being said, here is my general ranking, and I did a ton of different calcs. These are general order, not set in stone, as well as these are not purely based on calcs. I'm combining my calculation knowledge that we gained along with gameplay knowledge and experience playing Ayaka, and also speedrunning experience playing Ayaka, although it's not going to be just focused on speedrunning. Now, what is different with Ayaka? Because she's been released for many years now. And I'm sure you guys know I've been doing Ayaka guides for ages since she came out. I've done constellation investment calculations, Ayaka weapon calculations with all these different variations. And even in my old guides, I did come up with vertical investment priorities. But what is it with these new teams that makes all that TCI did useless? Well, what it is that Ayaka went from a hypercarry in a team like this, where she's basically doing all your team's damage, into now these new playstyles with Escoffier to where basically the whole team is doing damage. So for example, in this old team here, if you look at the damage split, she's maybe doing like 80 to 90% of your team's damage, versus what I've been getting in these new calcs to where, you know, she's probably doing barely more than 50% of the team's damage. At least with a 4-star weapon. Even with a 5-star weapon, it's still only slightly higher. And that is where we can start today's discussion, which is the downfall of mistsplitter. And this is the signature weapon that basically every Ayaka main got. You know, if she's a hypercarry doing all your team's damage, well, if you're getting like a 20 to 30% damage upgrade for Ayaka, why it was so good and why it was pretty much always recommended for you to get early is because that would translate very well into like a 20 to 30% team damage increase. In these new teams, it's very low in the priority, unfortunately. And that's because if Ayaka's doing 50% of your team's damage, well, that value is immediately getting halved. Not only that, but within the past year, we've got Finale of the Deep, which is a very strong 4-star weapon. And, you know, if you're comparing it in Ayaka's hypercarry teams, if I do that, mistsplitter was probably still an upgrade of about 17%, maybe slightly higher, slightly less. So not only is Ayaka doing less of the team's damage herself, but the upgrade in this team is actually less as well. And that's probably because mistsplitter has high base attack, but it doesn't actually give much attack. Whereas Finale of the Deep is almost entirely focused in attack. And the old teams like this, you are basically always getting this massive TTDS buff onto Ayaka, in addition to stuff like tenacity, noblesse. So Ayaka had a lot of attack buffs in these teams, whereas a team like this, you're losing that TTDS buff. So Ayaka's not getting as much attack, which means she gains much more from Finale's attack. So what used to be a very big priority weapon, and mistsplitter is always on Ayaka's banner whenever she runs, well actually now it's hard to really justify it. But I will get into later how mistsplitter can compound well with investment. Anyway, if mistsplitter is not a priority, what is a priority? Well, first of all, I have to assume a lot of people might not actually have this premium team. What budget team do we actually assume? The thing I am doing is I am assuming you have Escoffier. And that's because Escoffier is like the new core for this archetype. I do have to assume at the minimum you at least have Ayaka and Escoffier, and that's who you're building a team around. So I had to think, what was the budget non-shenhe team that we should start off with? And we had a debate on stream. I actually looked at the recent usage rates, and as you can see here, there's just so many teams full of 5 stars. So the first team without 5 stars was this team here. But the thing is, I was thinking about it, how many people actually have Rosaria built compared to having Kazuha built? And there's a good chance that what I'm gonna calc, Kazuha is probably gonna be similar or even slightly better. I don't know, it's even slightly better than a budget alternative like Rosaria. So I thought we have to just pick some team to start off with, and I might as well use this. And yeah, the calculation difference I got was actually the biggest one here. Also, since Shenhe is cryo, so she gives cryo particles, she does lower the team's ER requirements, whereas Kazuha, he does have Fav Sword, but the ER requirements could be slightly higher. So I did do a calc if you have to add like 10 ER to Ayaka and Escoffier, and it raises it from 25.8% to 29.6%. So around 25 to 30% increase is about what I'm getting for Shenhe. And honestly, Kazuha is pretty playable in this team. I was playing this team on stream. It was actually quite good, even though if you do play Kazuha, you don't get the max res shred from Escoffier. It was still pretty solid. And honestly, if you have this team, I would probably recommend Kazuha rather than playing a budget 4-star. Kazuha's grouping really does help Ayaka. You really notice it in at least Chamber 1 of the current Abyss. Just to quickly explain why it's not a bigger increase. Yes, you are losing 40% shred from Escoffier, but Kazuha is basically giving you that 40% back. On top of that, you're getting like 30 to 40% damage bonus, which obviously is not going to compare to what someone like Shenhe would bring for her entire kit, but he is adding some sort of net positive onto this team. On top of that, like I said, if you want to factor in Kazuha's consistency and extra damage he can give you, that's what sort of makes this team decent. So aside from Shenhe, what else is a very big improvement? And I think most people in the community can agree with this, but the next one is probably Escoffier C1. Now, as of making this video, Escoffier and her weapon is still on banner. She's still very strong without it, but if you did want to get some of this stuff, you still have time to. Just make sure if you don't have Ayaka yet, you still have enough primos saved for your Ayaka. But what does Escoffier C1 do, and why is it maybe a 16% damage increase? When you have a full team of Hydro and Cryo, your Cryo characters are basically getting 60% crit damage. Now what that does mean is your Hydro character like Furina is not getting anything, but potentially your 3 Cryos are getting 60% crit damage. And you know, as it turns out, that would be a lot of crit damage. Even more if you don't have something like mistsplitter, and if you have like a 4-star weapon like Finale of the Deep. So gaining that crit damage there is a very big deal. And if you look at my calcs, she goes from 1.05 mil to 1.19 mil with mistsplitter, but Escoffier C1, Ayaka actually gets more damage from that than she does from her signature weapon. Now it's important to remember, the real good thing about getting cryo crit damage is the way Shenhe's quills work. This actually scales with crit damage. So basically, not only is your DPS is gaining more damage, but the quills you get from Shenhe are also getting more damage, which is why this is a very nice increase. The only thing I would say is this C1 kind of scales worse with investment, and that's where the whole compounding investment thing comes in. It's still a very good upgrade, but like I said before, 60 crit damage when you have a 4-star weapon on Ayaka is going to be bigger than if you have mistsplitter where you're already getting crit damage. Now what you could do is switch your circlet from like a crit damage circlet to maybe an attack circlet if you have it. But then when muddying the waters, it's hard to calculate that. It comes down to your own builds. Also, like I said before, if you do switch your circlet to attack, then unfortunately that isn't going to scale with Shenhe's quills. So the damage you gain from attack could be cancelled out by the fact that you're not scaling well with Shenhe. Now, like I said, Escoffier still is on banner. Well, what else is on Escoffier's banner? It's her signature weapon. And I have this. It buffs her damage a lot. And not only that, when she heals characters, she does give a very big 32% attack. Almost kind of like a budget version of TTDS, but actually on a DPS weapon. And I have that at number 3. I actually got a clean 10% team damage increase here. But if you notice, it's not as big of a damage increase to Ayaka herself than getting something like mistsplitter or Escoffier C1. And it's pretty obvious, you know, for Ayaka herself, you're only really getting that 32% attack. But where you are getting the big increase is to Escoffier's personal damage. And you might notice I'm actually not getting as much damage as Escoffier C1 even to herself. But that is assuming you have the Battle Pass weapon deathmatch. There aren't that many good 4-star options. A lot of the 4-star options are for elemental burst characters like the Catch or Waybreaker's Fin. So if you don't have deathmatch and you have to use a budget option, I don't even know what you would be using, some sort of budget option, then the improvement to Escoffier's personal damage might be similar, maybe even more than going for her C1. It is important to realize, again, just like Escoffier C1, this attack boost here, your Hydro characters are probably HP scaling, so it's not going to be affecting them. And that is a general theme that we'll see throughout. The more investment you have in your teams, the less you care about your Hydro damage dealers damage, which is why very early I do recommend switching out to Tenacity of the Millith for Furina. It does lower her damage compared to Golden Troop, but you really do benefit from the attack buffs to the rest of your cryo characters. But what does benefit Furina and the entire team is Furina's C1. Now the thing is, it's actually pretty hard to calculate the exact damage gain you gain from Furina's C1. So here it means immediately after using her burst, you get 150 extra fanfare, times that by 25. That means when you cast her burst, whether you've got healing or not, you would immediately get 37.5 damage bonus to the entire team. But the limit is only increased by 100. At worst, you're getting about 25%. And in a team like this with Escoffier, her healing is not insane, but it's pretty good. You're probably benefiting closer to that 25% team damage bonus than you are from benefiting from that 37.5. So I guess I'm kind of lowballing it here. If you're only getting on average 25% to 30% extra damage bonus, it's not going to be quite as big as some of the other upgrades. I'm getting just below 10%, even though this is the first upgrade that really actually increases Furina's damage. My calcs are pretty high because I'm assuming level 10 talents on your team, but you'll see with other people's calcs who are assuming level 9 talents, she's going to be doing less than 300k damage per rotation. So like I said, it's not worth focusing too much on her damage, but it's still quite high because the damage increase is still very nice. On top of that, Furina is a pretty versatile character, so if you do get her C1, you could be using her in a wide variety of teams, not just these freeze teams. So that could be something to consider, and yeah, overall, it's still a pretty good damage increase. Now, I did calculate some compounding investments here, which is showing how Escoffier's weapon scales well with investment. Because like I said, if you got this, you're getting that extra attack buff to Ayaka, which is making up for the fact that you're not playing her with TTDS. So if your Ayaka has Finale of the Deep, you'll only get about 10% damage from Escoffier's weapon. But if your Ayaka has mistsplitter, you're getting a little bit more. You're getting a bit over 11%. Or you can look at that vice versa. You can look at it if you have Escoffier's weapon, you're now getting more from mistsplitter. Now this is one of the trickiest things to talk about, and I've spent a lot of videos talking about this, which is the value of Shenhe C1, which basically gives her one extra skill if you're one rotating content, which means you get more quill damage and you're also getting more energy particles generated. It's a very versatile and it's a very skill expressive constellation here, but it's also extremely hard to calc. And the reason why it's extremely hard to calc, the reason why it looks lower than you might think it is because like I said, the C1 doesn't permanently give you one extra use. Therefore you can't just add in this extra hit here. But for those of you interested in high performance gameplay or like speed running, stuff like that, you'll know that Shenhe C1 is something that people have been getting very early. It's always been one of the strongest upgrades for Ayaka, especially in stuff like speedrunning. Even to the point where I've always been saying Shenhe C1 is stronger than Ayaka's constellations. So the way I try to just give some sort of calculation to it is I stopped looking at DPS and I just looked at the damage per rotation, because that's how you play it. You kind of just sneak in an extra hold E, The other thing is, if you're one rotating a lot of content, or that's just free energy, which means if you're a very strong player, you can lower your energy recharge requirements. And not only that, but you can switch from a supported weapon like Fav Lance to something like Skyward Spine, maybe even her signature, for even more quill damage, because you need the ER less. The only thing is, if you stick with that budget weapon, then you're not benefiting as much from those quills, so that further reduces the damage you get from that. The thing is, it's all about the threshold. So shenhe C1 can help you destroy the enemy before having to do another rotation. It could be the difference between one rotation and like 1.5. So that damage increase can go up way higher. And on top of that, the extra energy that you get could be the difference between having your bursts up straight away for your next chamber versus not having them at all. So there's so many factors that go into it, to where the C1 can be way higher than the numbers I'm giving you here. So I guess that gives you more insight to how it's really hard to calculate the value of shenhe C1, even though it's extremely popular and very strong. You might also be wondering, why am I using the mix set when Noblesse calculates higher on a spreadsheet? And what I always say is, you can use either. You can use Noblesse or mix sets. The thing is, you don't really play this team like you would on a spreadsheet. Calculations basically look at a perfect scenario for Noblesse, which is a low-ish investment and always doing the same rotation, always doing Shenhe's burst, which means you're very consistently getting this attack buff to the team. Whereas you're usually looking at the weakest scenario for mix sets, which is that the mix set strength is that it's more flexible, and sometimes you don't always use Shenhe's burst. Sometimes you have stronger weapons than Fav Lance. Sometimes you use her hold more for extra quill damage. So it really comes down to two things. It comes down to what pieces you have. Do you have Noblesse set? Do you have mix set? But it also comes down to, do you prefer the consistency from the Noblesse set, or do you prefer more flexibility from the mix sets? Like I said, overall, this is not for speedrunners. This is more of a general recommendation. So even though you could make the argument to put shenhe C1 maybe closer to the top, I'm going to put it here because I think these ones are pretty much always upgrades, whereas shenhe C1, it takes a bit more finesse and it's a bit more variable. It's really hard to factor in how this affects your gameplay, so I'm going to put it here. I'm still going to put it above mistsplitter because it's just that good. It's just so good. And the last thing I want to look at is the more compounding investment, which is improving shenhe's weapon from something like Fav Lance into Calamity Queller. This is shenhe's signature weapon. It just gives her a lot more attack. Because it doesn't give you ER like Fav Lance, and a team like this, you probably want like 160 energy recharge on shenhe. It's not a straight upgrade because you probably do have to build more ER with this weapon, but the attack increase is massive, which both affects her damage and obviously also increases her quill damage. And yeah, when you have shenhe C1 and Calamity Queller, then Calamity Queller is about an 8% damage improvement. But that's with me not really factoring in the ER because it's quite difficult. A lot of people get shenhe C1 before her weapon just because Fav Lance is very nice for energy. But once you do have the C1, this can also give you energy as well. If you have C1 R1, you have higher ER requirements or lower ER requirements. It really depends on your gameplay. So I just left it about the same, and that's how I got about 8% damage improvement. And I say here, it can be stronger than mistsplitter in a vacuum, but this is Ayaka mains. Even if Calamity Queller can be slightly stronger in a vacuum, you probably do want to get mistsplitter at some point because it's Ayaka's signature weapon. She's going to be on banner and it does scale very well with investments. If you compound all these investments, then mistsplitter could overtake Calamity Queller. Plus, you don't actually really need Calamity Queller. Once people have C1, a lot of people use something like Skyward Spine, maybe even Engulfing. You can even use this weapon on shenhe. Look, if I compare it to Fav Lance, I have 3.4k attack. If I switch to this event weapon, and I use her skill, I get over 300 more attack there. So far, all the investments we've talked about, this actually lines up very well with all the gameplay I've seen over the years, and especially with these new teams. A lot of the hardcore Ayaka mains get these sort of investments. The team is 4 cost by default because it's 4 5-stars. So 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So this is about a 10 cost team. And you will see a lot of Ayaka mains, a lot of Dolphin Ayaka mains, they have about 10, 11 cost. And a lot of the costs that they do have are the things that I've mentioned so far. So now we get into more the trickier ones, which is the ones that are really hard to calculate. And I'm sure people know by now, but Furina's C1 is generally better than her C2 in most teams. And people usually make the mistake thinking the C2 is the bigger increase, as it does massively boost her fanfare gain. But if you are already playing a team with a good healer, someone like Escoffier, then that's not the main benefit of this. The main benefit of this is that it increases Furina's HP, which increases her personal damage. The thing is, in a team like this, as we've said, her personal damage isn't that important. But it's nice, don't get me wrong, but it's not that important. Whereas, for example, if you're playing in a team like this with Leaflet, then her personal damage is much more important. So I couldn't really give you an approximate damage increase for that, just because it varies quite a lot. A lot of people will get it regardless, just because, as we've seen over time, Furina's constellations are very popular anyway. So maybe you have this, but yeah, in the ranking, I'm just going to put it here. Now, you might see Escoffier C2 here and be a bit confused, because this sounds very good. However, as we've seen over the past week, Escoffier C2 is good, but it's not actually that popular. What this does is it basically gives her shenhe quills. They're called cold dish stacks, and when your on-field cryo character deals damage, you get this extra quill boost. Now, you might see this massive multiplier here, so she gets 5 of these quill sort of things for 240% multiplier each. So you could do 240 times 5, 1200. And then we can look at Shenhe's own quills, and you can see it's about 82, and she'll give 5 for each cryo character, so you times that times 3. And you will see it's about the same thing. They both get about 1200. The thing is, why Escoffier C2 is so low is because that's not the full story. There's several reasons why Shenhe's quills are just better overall. The first one is that you don't just get one set of quills, you can get 2, maybe even 3. So if you look at using her skill twice per rotation, then that 1200, you can just times it by 2. Potentially even more if you're using her hold at some points as well. The other thing is Escoffier C2 is based on her own attack, whereas Shenhe's quills are 82% of her own attack. I have Escoffier's signature weapon, I have Shenhe on Fav Lance, but their attack is not quite the same. In fact, I have about 50% more attack on Shenhe, and that's because with Shenhe, you're stacking as much attack as possible. With Escoffier, you're not just building attack, but you're probably also building a lot of damage as well. Now, to be fair, I do have a cryo damage bonus goblet. If you have attack, then it might be slightly more. And you can get some attack buffs from this weapon as well. But Escoffier's attack will never reach the same that you get in Shenhe. Shenhe will get 2 sets of quills, and she might even get 50% more attack, so it's just a lot higher. The other thing with Escoffier C2 is that these activate when your active character deals cryo damage. Now that means it's not for every character in the team, and also it means you can't really control who's activating it. Now if you look at my calcs, the quill damage you get from Ayaka or from Escoffier is pretty similar. Maybe 13k, maybe 15k, depends on your weapon, depends on your investment. Could go up to almost 20k extra damage per quill if you have Ayaka on a signature weapon. And that's because Escoffier and Ayaka have a lot of crit damage, they have a lot of cryo damage, they just have a lot of damage bonus in their kit. With Shenhe, you're stacking a lot of attack, and she doesn't have as much things to scale her quills off of. So if you look at the quill damage that Shenhe gets from her quills, she's getting well less than half. And when you play these teams, Shenhe probably will be activating a few of Escoffier's quills here. You might be able to adjust your rotation so Shenhe steals less. Yeah, Shenhe proccing these quills compared to Ayaka is going to be a big damage decrease as well. And the last thing that makes Shenhe's quills better is that Shenhe's quills generate energy. Especially if you get this C1, you're getting more energy out of this. Whereas Escoffier C2, this is just extra damage. You're not getting any extra energy, any extra utility. So anyway, whilst it's nice, you know, free damage is free damage, I think I made my case that it's just not going to compare to Shenhe C1, which will make it over here, which is why I put it here. And the last things I'll put is Ayaka C1 and C2. Now you might remember in my old calcs, Ayaka C1 and C2 are pretty decent. Basically, her burst goes from one big burst into 2 extra ones on the side. Each of them dealing 20% of the original burst hit, which means 20% plus 20%. If all of them hit, it's a 40% damage increase to her burst damage. But once you minus her skill damage and her normal attacks, her charge attacks, it will be less than that 40%. The thing is, this C2 is very inconsistent. Very rarely will the miniature burst actually hit. On top of that, we're no longer talking about a hypercarry team anymore. As we said in the start of the video, Ayaka's damage in these teams is not hypercarry at all, which means that 27% damage increase, you can divide that by 2, so maybe it's a 13-14% in these new teams if all the hits actually hit. Not only that, but it's even more inconsistent because I found in my experience, and I have the C2, but that the more burst hits you're getting, the more enemies are being staggered back when they're not freezed. Which means enemies like the pyro guy here who you can't freeze, I'm staggering him more than you would at C0. Now when you are getting that full damage increase, which as you can see in my PMA fight, very stonks, very nice damage. But like I said, at best, it's still not quite as good as some of the biggest upgrades. So I'll put it near the bottom. You know, I don't have it here, but something like furina's C3 could also be here. It's just not a big priority. I should also say it's been very well discussed at this point, but a lot of people do consider Escoffier a very strong character at low investment, but there really isn't that much desire to get much more than that. A lot of people really do just stop at C1, R1 Escoffier. Her other constellations are just not that important. She's just very strong at low investment. Same thing with Shenhe. You might see this C2 and then think it's good. This burst extension here only does something for sustained fights, but most of your damage will be much more concentrated, which means you don't really benefit that much from it. And this is just 15% cryo crit damage for your active character, which is garbage. It's got to be a C1, 60% cryo crit damage to the whole team. You know, she does the constellations after that, just like Ayaka does, but I'm not really going to bother talking about that. So those are the things I calculated, those are the things I looked at, those are the things I would recommend if you are doing vertical investment. Hopefully you found that helpful. For all the Ayaka mains who have been playing her in the Abyss recently and have been enjoying the new power, congratulations to us all. Ayaka is extremely strong at the moment. You might say, yeah, she's carried by Escoffier, but I would say it's a really good thing for a DPS to have good synergy with some of the strongest supports. So you shouldn't look at it as a bad thing for Ayaka. It's a good thing. You know, you could say she's being carried, but you could also say she is making use of Escoffier's kit the most. But anyway, who cares what people think? A lot of us are just enjoying her and enjoying her new strength. Good luck to anyone pulling her on a rerun. Good luck to anyone who's watched this video and wants to vertically invest in a few things. Hopefully you found this video helpful, and yeah, thanks for watching everyone.